Have you ever seen one of these? When you're young, you usually have time and energy, but no money. And when you grow old, you have time and money, but maybe not the same energy. These images might not always be very accurate, but they show that some parameters coexist and are dependent on one another. This is also true for the subject of today's video. Let's talk about one of the most important aspects of photography and filmmaking, more specifically, understanding how to correctly or purposely expose a scene. The three things to keep in mind when talking about the exposure triangle are aperture, shutter speed, and ISO. These are in-camera settings and variables that you need to think of if you don't go full auto mode. They all interact and are dependent of one another. To get a perfectly exposed scene, these three elements must be in balance. Let's talk about aperture. It basically refers to the opening of the lens. The wider it is, the more light the sensor will capture. More light equals a brighter image. And a more narrow opening means a reduced exposure. When we talk about aperture, we also talk about the f-stop or the f-number. To not overcomplicate things, we can say that the f-stop is the number that your camera shows when you change the size of the lens aperture. The higher the number, the smaller the aperture, meaning less light passing through to ultimately expose the sensor. Lenses with a lower f-stop like 2.8 or 1.4 are usually more expensive and normally of a higher quality. You often refer to them as faster glass. The aperture element also decides what and how much is in focus. It dictates the famous expression depth of field. The greater the aperture, the smaller the area in focus will be. And when narrowed apertures are being used, you'll end up having a bigger area in focus. Shutter speed is basically how long time the shutter of the camera stays open. When the shutter is open, the sensor is exposed to light, and the longer it remains open, the brighter the image will be. And the exact opposite the other way around. Shutter speed also decides motion. This is important to keep in mind both when taking still images but also when filming. A fast shutter speed lets you capture quick-moving subjects and sort of freeze them in action. A slow shutter speed gives you a more dreamy and soft look when, for example, photographing waterfalls and moving waters like rivers. This is commonly known as long exposures. To get the natural motion blur when filming, you want to set the shutter speed to the double of your chosen frame rate. If you film in 24 frames per second, it should be around 1/50th of a second. Different cameras offer different settings, but always aim to get as near the double as your camera can come. ISO is the third element to the exposure triangle, and it only really decides how sensible to light the sensor is. An increased ISO artificially makes the image brighter, to the cost of oftentimes worse quality. Shooting in darkness comes to the price of having to bump up the ISO, and different cameras performs differently in these conditions, and you will notice more digital noise as you raise the ISO. ISO 3200 on some cameras are totally fine, while on others you will clearly see some digital noise that will reduce the overall quality of your image. Now, in some conditions, especially when filming, you will face troubles when choosing your settings to achieve the look you're after. Let's say you want to get this creamy bokeh when filming a scene, and you want to keep the natural motion blur, but the harsh sun outside overexposes the frame. You could raise the shutter speed, but that would cost you the natural motion blur and it wouldn't look very cinematic. Then you could add a fourth element to the triangle to make it more adjustable, and that is an ND filter, the camera sunglass. An ND filter is a neutral density filter which blocks some of the light. A tip is to get an adjustable or variable ND filter so you can quickly change and fine-tune the setting as you wish. This was a quick introduction to the exposure triangle, and we could dive way deeper into it. If this is something you would like to learn more of, please let me know down below in the comment section. I hope you learned something new today, and if you did, please hit the thumbs up and consider subscribing. Take care. Bye.